He asked things like, what should you do first at a crime scene? What should you never touch? What should you record before interpretation contaminates memory? Up to this point in the series, the real Sherlocks have looked like specialists. And now that I say that out loud, they kind of sound like a band. Joseph Bell sharpened observation. Henry Littlejohn brought proof into court. Eugene Vidocq mastered infiltration. Edmund Locard proved that contact leaves trace. And Jerome Caminada weaponized invisibility. Of all of these skills, they depend on the individual, the discipline, their restraint, their competence under pressure. And that's really quite fragile. People get tired. They get emotional. They rush. They assume. So the next real Sherlock asks a dangerous question. What happens even when the expert gets it wrong? And instead of trusting brilliance, he built a system. His name was Hans Gross. Before Hans Gross, criminal investigation was treated like an art. Good detectives were admired for instinct. Bad ones were excused as simply being unlucky. And Gross didn't accept that. He believed crime could be investigated scientifically, not just with tools, but with procedures that prevented human error. He asked things like, what should you do first at a crime scene? What should you never touch? What should you record before interpretation contaminates memory? And by asking those questions, he changes everything. Hans Gross was an Austrian examining magistrate working at the end of the 19th century, a very important role. A magistrate didn't just investigate crime. He evaluates the evidence after it had already passed through multiple hands. And Gross kept seeing the same problem. Evidence wasn't wrong. Handling was wrong. Scenes were contaminated, footprints destroyed, blood patterns misinterpreted, witness memories altered by questioning, not because investigators were malicious, because they were human. So Gross does something radical. He wrote the first comprehensive handbook of scientific criminal investigation, titled System der Kriminalistik. Now, that wasn't a collection of tricks. It was a framework designed to protect truth from the investigator. So here's why I think Hans Gross belongs in a series about Sherlock Holmes. Gross explicitly validated Sherlock Holmes. He treated Holmes not as fiction, but as a correct model of reasoning. But Gross went further. Where Holmes demonstrates how to think, Gross formalized how to act on the backside. He even designed an early detective field kit containing tools for measuring, for collecting, for documenting and preserving evidence. If Holmes is considered the mind of the detective, Hans Gross is more like the manual that keeps the mind from sabotaging itself. Gross's defining skill wasn't deduction, it was anticipating failure. He understood something that most people still resist. Competence does not eliminate error. It merely changes its shape. So Gross built systems that assumed the investigator would jump to conclusions and misremember sequences, or overvalue dramatic clues, contaminate scenes unintentionally. And instead of trusting discipline alone, he imposes structure. For example, you document before touching, you measure before moving, you describe before interpreting, and that sequencing matters. Once interpretation enters, memory changes. Gross was one of the first to treat observer bias as a threat equal to the criminal. which, if you really think about it, is an uncomfortable idea. Before Gross, investigators were judged by their outcomes. And after Gross, they are judged by the process. That changes accountability, because now failure could be traced not just to criminals, but to investigative error. And that forces a cultural shift, almost, from heroics to professionalism. Sherlock Holmes looks like this lone rogue genius. Hans Gross ensured that even average investigators could perform competently if they followed the system. That is how disciplines scale. Hans Gross is almost painfully relevant today. You think about lesson 1. Structure protects you when cognition degrades, under stress or fatigue or emotion. Your thinking narrows. So your checklists, they don't insult intelligence. They do their best to preserve it. Lesson 2. Process beats confidence. If your method only works when you're calm and fresh and focused and well-fed and rested, it's fragile. Gross built systems for worst-case cognition. Lesson 3 might be that bias is not a moral failure. Gross didn't accuse investigators of dishonesty. He assumed normal human limitations. That humility is what made his work powerful. And that applies far beyond crime scenes. It goes to interviews, to assessments, to security planning, to intelligence analysis. Anywhere that consequences exist. Gross's detective kit looked suspiciously like one Holmes carries in the stories. Not because Doyle copied Gross directly, but because they both arrived at the same conclusion. Preparation beats improvisation. The difference is that Gross wrote it down and then forced others to follow it. So Bell taught Sherlock how to see. Little John taught him how to prove. Vidocq teaches him how to infiltrate. Locard teaches him how to trace. Caminada taught him how to disappear. So Hans Gross teaches him how to avoid fooling himself, which is maybe the most important Sherlockian skill of all. Because brilliance without structure doesn't scale. Next up, we step away from investigation to physical confrontation. Because the next real Sherlock didn't sharpen the mind. He trained the body to survive.